Welcome back. And what a powerful opening to the General Assembly's high-level meetings. Those remarks and discussions really reinforce how the Sustainable Development Goals are the blueprint for fighting poverty and hunger, confronting the climate crises, achieving gender equality, and so much more within the next 10 years. At this time of great uncertainty, the SDGs show the way forward to a strong recovery from COVID-19 and a better future for all on a safe and healthy planet. Now, that actually couldn't have been more perfect to lead us into our continued discussion on COVID recovery and equitable vaccine distribution. To lead a discussion, please welcome Michael Sheldrick, co-founder and Chief Policy Impact and Government Relations Officer at Global Citizen. Over to you, Mick.
Well, thanks, Tolu, and thanks for inviting me to moderate this panel, Stepping Up, a response to the COVID-19 pandemic and a changing world through environmental, social, and governance initiatives, with all of these extraordinary people joining me today. First and foremost, for those who aren't aware of Global Citizen, we're a movement of millions of advocates around the world, and our mission as an organization is to end extreme poverty, tackle inequality, and protect the planet in line with the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And right now, our team is all busy preparing for this weekend's Global Citizen Live, once-in-a-generation 24-hour worldwide event with festivals and performances across 6 continents. So this is an open invitation to everyone watching to join us on this journey as we travel from Lagos to Paris, Rio, New York City, London, Seoul, Los Angeles, Sydney, and more. But importantly, this week, as the world comes together in New York, is not a time for celebration. It's a time for unity as we defend the planet and defeat poverty. And of course, what is more top of mind than anything else I can think of right now is vaccine equity, which brings us to today's important discussion. Well before COVID-19 vaccines began to be distributed at the end of last year, leaders around the world repeatedly emphasized how important equitable access would be, both as a moral and strategic initiative. It's why leaders and actors sprung up in April last year with the ACT Accelerator, why in June last year they stepped up with COVAX. This was all informed by previous experience like the H1N1 pandemic and HIV/AIDS, where in the face of global health threats, wealthy countries leveraged their power to effectively control access to vaccines, therapeutics, and other tools. With this pandemic, the hope was that things would be different. But unfortunately, what we've seen in much of the world is that it's been worse. Vaccine nationalism, export controls, and structural inequities, including around international trading rules, have all prevented lower income countries from accessing the life-saving tools they need to protect themselves, and finally slow the spread of COVID-19 globally. We can't ignore the decisions that have put us in this position, but what we can do is figure out the way forward. At the moment, we've got the situation where 5.6 billion doses have been administered so far globally, and close to 80% have been in upper income countries compared to just 0.3% across all low income countries. Most frustratingly, that number hasn't moved at all this year. Ultimately, equity means having the same rights and opportunities at the same time towards an equal outcome. It does not mean wealthier nations first, poorer nations second, or for many, maybe not at all. So the challenge before us is to right this wrong. And I look forward to today's discussion to help generate ideas in that direction. Now, before I begin, I know some of you spoke and heard from the CEO of Pfizer this morning. And this commitment to help the United States deliver hundreds of millions of doses will certainly be welcome in some quarters. But I did just quickly have a time to speak to some of my advocate friends. And what they really stressed is the point that equitable access through donation is not really a long-term solution. Donations are a stopgap only. Ultimately, they're inefficient. They're often earmarked politically and result in higher wastage rate. And ultimately, the view is we must empower countries and COVAX to be able to buy and produce vaccines themselves, including through supporting measures such as the mRNA hub in South Africa. So I'm sure there will be more on that later. Obviously, a lot of viewpoints about how we address this. But right now, I'm honored to be joined by a world-class group of experts. We've got a very good friend of mine, Bruce Aylward from the World Health Organization, Rich Lesser, CEO of Boston Consulting Group, and we also have Mossadiki joining us from GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. And so I'm going to allow each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And Bruce, I'm going to throw to you first.
Well, thank you very much, Mick, and thanks for the chance to join. My name is Bruce Aylward, as mentioned. I'm a senior advisor to our Director General here at the World Health Organization. But most importantly, over the last 12 months, 18 months now, I've had the opportunity to do what I think is one of the most important roles I've ever played, and that is coordinate the work across 10 leading international health agencies called the ACT Accelerator, and that stands for the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator. This was the brainchild of Dr. Tedros and other leaders back in April of last year, as Mick mentioned, and it was a recognition that we needed a massive effort to accelerate the development of new tools and their equitable distribution if we were going to get out of this pandemic as rapidly as possible. And I've had the honor to lead that, and I'm happy to share some insights from where we've gotten and where we need to go next, Mick, as we go forward.
Well, thanks, Bruce. Rich, over to you.
Great. So I'm Rich Lesser. I'm the CEO of BCG. BCG is a global consulting firm that takes on many topics, but in particular, we have an extraordinary team that tackles a whole range of social impact issues all around the world and has for decades. When COVID hit, it was clear that this was going to touch all parts of society and all sectors, the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector, and that all of those groups needed to be mobilized if we were going to be able to make progress against this enormous fight we were all in. The personal role I played is as a member of the Business Roundtable. I joined the board and took the lead of our COVID response task force last fall, and really focusing on both educating CEOs about what was going on, but in particular, what are the kind of positions that we could advocate for to accelerate the end of the pandemic around the world and what needed to be done. As a firm, BCG's had the privilege to work and support social sector, amazing organizations that are in this fight and have been doing heroic things to try to make a difference, as well as public sector governments and many private sector organizations around the world. So it's a privilege to be able to join this group on a topic of this importance. So thank you for having me.
Well, thanks, Rich, and we look forward to your insights. And lastly, Ms., I want to go to you, and I really appreciate you stepping in just with 10 minutes notice because our friend Marie-Ange wasn't able to join us. So Ms., over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and nice to be in a panel, albeit a short notice. But fantastic to be just on a distinguished panel here. So my name is Mossadiki. I'm heading up our private sector partnerships innovations team at GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance. And actually what we're here, the panel is representative of GAVI. We are a public-private partnership set up in 2000, really to focus the cumulative and comparative advantage of the private sector along with ingenuity and resources, to focus that effort on a real social sector and focus that effort on critical challenges, particularly in vaccination of infants around the world. And it's with that experience that GAVI has been a key part of the overall COVAX initiative as part of the ACT Accelerator, as Bruce mentioned, to really look at how we are sort of engaging vaccine manufacturers and supporting and driving that effort and focusing effort on one of the biggest challenges of our time, which is ending this pandemic and maybe stabilizing the global economy and society as we move forward. So building upon GAVI's decades of experience of aligning with interests from the private sector and focusing on programmatic challenges and making sure vaccines get everywhere. I think we're on a key stage at the moment, a critical moment in that critical moment in history, really, of how we're going to move forward on this significant challenge, and excited to talk about sort of what we're doing on that effort with the private sector and beyond.
Well, thanks, Moz. And we'll make sure we go easy on you, given you had so little time to prepare, but really grateful again. Bruce, I want to throw to you first. And I've been fortunate enough to really hear the perspectives from Bruce since the start of the pandemic. I remember early on, and I think it was March last year, he got on the phone with our entire team around the organization and on multiple occasions shared his perspective. But I guess with 18 months now of experience and insights, Bruce, in your view, how has the pandemic exposed the vulnerability of developing countries, and in particular, I guess, the weaknesses inherent in our multilateral system to respond to shocks such as this?
Mick, thanks. But I first want to speak to the strengths, Mick, because when a pandemic hits, maybe to take a step back, as Mick, I've spent my life working with crises in low, middle income countries, infectious disease, other crises, and quite often the world comes to their aid, right? But in those situations, like the Ebola crisis in West Africa, it was very different in this because you have a pandemic, every country was struggling with it, and the low, middle income countries, the countries you're referring to, a little bit left to their own devices. And I think what we saw was some real strengths, Mick. We saw these countries that have spent years running and managing infectious diseases, that have got strong community networks, leveraging all of this to try and respond to this pandemic. And there, I think we saw a lot of heroism as well as a lot of impact. Now, where we saw the vulnerabilities, though, we saw the lower income countries and developing countries have real challenges that continue to this day to be able to access the countermeasures that they need to be able to tackle this disease properly. And quite frankly, they've just not been in the position to compete, because frankly, that's been what's happening with high income countries, producing countries, to be able to access the tests they need to be able to say, this is what our pandemic looks like here, here's how it's evolving. Then now we're seeing the tragic situation where they cannot access vaccines. So the multilateral system, so they've had real vulnerabilities in terms of mainly their ability to in a pandemic situation, which affects all countries, to compete for scarce resources that are crucial to saving lives, tracking the pandemic, and turning it around, quite frankly. Now, the multilateral system stepped in, and we put in place the ACT Accelerator. We put in place the different pillars, one for tests, one for treatments, and one for vaccines that we call COVAX. And these were fantastic solutions that were designed to pool procurement, pool the risk of development, and then share the scarce resources. But we also saw the limits of multilateralism because it depends on us having a war chest of financing, because we were in a market environment where we had to compete to be able to buy product for the poorest countries, and then to ensure that those contracts get served. And the weaknesses we're seeing now, Mick, right now, and the tragic situation is, while there's great intent out there by those manufacturers to see their vaccine used in the lowest income countries, they aren't. And that's because we, the multilateral system, get moved down the queue in terms of procuring those vaccines, because we don't, let's be frank, we don't sue. We try to take a collaborative approach to this. And the reality is, although we put this fabulous system in place, we're not able to leverage in a market economy right now the levers needed to ensure that the mechanisms put in place for low-income countries actually get served. So we've seen the strengths of the developing countries of the multilateral system, but also the weaknesses in that not everyone wants to play by the rules.
And I saw just on that last point about, the strengths and weaknesses and people not playing by the rules, that today you announced Gordon Brown as a new WHO ambassador, former British Prime Minister. And I would just encourage everyone to check out what he has to say on this, because he certainly made some strong remarks over the weekend, and so encourage everyone to check that out. But Moz, this is really a good segue to you, because, you know, Bruce spoke about the fact that the multilateral system was often put last in the queue. And of course, GAVI, you know, spearheading the COVAX initiative, I mean, you were right in the thick of those discussions and negotiations. So are you able to maybe give us an insight into how you approach this challenge and how you're still approaching it, given these weaknesses Bruce alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And just to, you know, build upon what Bruce has said, at the early stage of the pandemic, it became very clear that we needed, you know, not just access to vaccines and production in a safe and efficient manner, which we have, but we need to make sure those vaccines were available globally at the right time and at the same time for everybody. This really triggered a call for a solution that would accelerate development on the manufacture of these vaccines in an unprecedented manner and provide comfort and confidence both to on the supply side, but also to the countries that were sort of necessarily requiring those vaccines. And as Bruce mentioned, this led to the creation of COVAX, which essentially is which sits under the ACT the tools initiative, but is solely focused on ensuring that we have the right vaccines available to the world. And it really is a solution that we can be proud of, and we continue to learn and continue to evolve this COVAX solution, which is a collaboration between the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, the World Health Organization, who sort of understands how we are making sure we have the right vaccines in a safe and effective way, delivered to the right populations, and then GAVI, its significant strength and almost our comparative advantage in COVAX is the ability to pull together the demands from the manufacturers, understand how manufacturers are operating, and provide that upfront support so that they can accelerate the development of these vaccines for the rest of the world. And that's exactly what COVAX is doing, ensuring that those countries who may not have the resources to purchase these vaccines have that power. And by pooling the comparative weight of the rest of the world, and we're now talking about 91 sort of lower to middle-income countries, we're able to ensure that we're at the table. Now, can we do more? Absolutely. And as Bruce mentioned, there's a call for a lot of organizations, particularly the pharma industry and others, to sort of help us move towards that through donations and making sure that the manufacturing capacity is available for these countries. But it's imperative to understand that this is driven by a global economic rationale, as well as a sort of moral imperative. And we can talk about that later, but it really is important for this audience to understand that the rationale for organizations and governments and civil society, in fact, as a multi-stakeholder coalition, which is what GAVI is, to really come behind this principle of equity and global equity. That's the way that we are going to get ourselves on the path back to a new normal, and by bringing forward these forces, I think we're able to do so.
Well, thanks, Moz, and that's perhaps a good segue over to you, Rich. I mean, we heard a lot about the idea of different stakeholders, and Moz was just touching on the economic case. And I remember early on this year, the International Chamber of Commerce, led by John Denton, released a report showcasing that if we didn't invest in vaccine equity and make it a reality for everyone, that the global economy would see $9 trillion wiped out, more than half of which would impact developed countries. So this idea that it's just a moral exercise, it's also a health exercise because no one is safe until everyone's safe, but it's also this economic case. So would love to hear from you about how BCG has been helping in the fight against COVID-19.
Well, I'll be fast on that, and then I'll get to the points we've just been discussing, which is from the very early days, we felt this was an urgent situation where the strengths of BCG could make a positive contribution, because at one level, of course, it's just understanding massive amounts of data for a pandemic that had never been studied before, and trying to understand the severity, and groups that had, had strong health capabilities, but were not necessarily ready for a pandemic to bring capability. So we've worked with governments all around the world, and sometimes below the federal level, and states in the US and elsewhere, to try to understand and figure out how to mobilize government resources to have the biggest impact, to both take on the disease itself, but also the economic consequences, and to protect livelihoods as well as lives. We've worked extensively with NGOs around the world to take on some of the unbelievable challenges that they've stepped up to, that Moz and Bruce just articulated so well, to try to take on this and to do that, and then of course to work in the private sector, both to help address issues like critical supply chain issues and debottlenecking, and lower the roles of supplies and strengthening supply chains, but then to have many organizations just trying to figure out how to support their workforces, what to do in these difficult times to manage their own businesses through a crisis. So we've had a very multifaceted response, just trying to contribute wherever we could, with the kind of capabilities that we have, and to do that. I just want to come back to the conversation we were just having, and just highlight how important it is to set a very ambitious goal for ending this global pandemic. In my mind, that's like a 2022 goal, which, sitting in September of 21, having not made as much progress in many places as we want, that's a high bar to set, but we will have the vaccine to do it. It will not be a vaccine. The world is producing over 10 billion doses this year, and probably over 10 billion doses or more next year. So divide that by the population of the world. The vaccine limitation is not the issue. The issue is, how do we get the vaccines to the right places, and how do we manage the unbelievable complexity, not just of global supply chains and mapping supply to demand, but in-country administrative resources, addressing population issues, having not just enough vaccines, but enough vaccinations take place. And what COVAX, what ACT-A have been doing has been heroic to try to make progress on that dimension. This is an area we believe that the public, private, and social sectors can work together on. There are skills in the private sector that can make a very big difference in logistics and supply chain, and navigating some of the challenges on the demand side of this. But only can be as impactful as they could be is if they're within a framework that's led by governments, led by organizations like COVAX and ACT-A, to be able to really mobilize and channel those capabilities and resources the right way. And Bruce started on a positive note. I just want to end on my comment on one, which is like the fact that we're in a place, less than 24 months after the pandemic started, where we could have 10 billion doses produced of vaccines at this level of efficacy and this level of safety, would have literally seemed, I think, like a bit of a dream, if we were sitting back 15, 18 months ago. So it's not a gift, because a lot of people worked incredibly hard to get us to that stage, but that's the fortunate part of this. Now it's on all of us to get those vaccines into the right places and get beyond this, because the economic consequences, the human consequences are the main point, and the number of lives and livelihoods at risk from a sustained pandemic, the livelihoods and lives impact of the next variants coming along, if we don't get this under control, place enormous risk across all aspects of society, starting with SDG number 1, which is poverty. When you tank economies, you drive up poverty, in addition to costing in terms of health terms. So we have to work together aggressively over the next 12 to 24 months to be able to tackle this.
No, I agree 100%. And your last point about poverty, I mean, already we've seen the reports that 160 million people are set to be pushed into extreme poverty by the end of this year because of the pandemic. So, the longer the pandemic goes on, the longer the higher those figures will go. But just, you mentioned two things I want to build on, and I want to come back to you, Bruce, because you mentioned this idea of the world finally setting a goal. And, for far too long, the G7 and others have been criticized for not actually putting forth a comprehensive roadmap to end the pandemic for everyone and achieve herd immunity. And now, in a few days' time, we have this summit being convened by President Biden, and he's put out this target to get us to 70% global immunity or vaccine coverage by this time next year. And you also mentioned the fact that we will be producing as many as 10 billion doses this year and at least that amount next year. So the actual creation of the vaccine itself shouldn't be the issue here. But the question is, what is the issue to achieving that target? And Bruce, I know you've long grappled with this, but how are we going to get there over the next 12 months when, of course, I note the belief there's obviously a great urgency to get there even earlier if we can. But over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mick. And first, let's look at what the targets are, folks, and how close we've gotten, because then let's anchor this in the right conversation. So in May, the Director General of the World Health Organization went out and said, we need to get to 70% coverage by the middle of 2022, and we can achieve it based on production, expected production. So he said, but we need interim targets to make sure we're on track, right? So in May of 2021, so 4 or 5 months ago, the Director General said, by the end of September, every country should have vaccinated 10% of its population. By the end of this year, every country should have vaccinated 40% of its population. And they're more on track to hit that 70% by the middle of next year. So those were the big targets. And when you ask me, how are we doing? Today, 90% of high-income countries are over 10% coverage. 90% of upper middle income countries have hit 10% coverage. 50% of lower middle income countries have hit 10%. 50%, that's it. The vast majority of low income countries have not achieved that. If you look at the lowest income countries, to the low income group, the bottom 28% of the world, 0. So 5 months ago, we set the target of let's get to 10% in every country. And the world said, that's not ambitious enough. We said, well, let's try and get there. And no low income country has gotten there. And Mick, to your other question, well, why not? What do we have to do? They couldn't get there because we couldn't get them the vaccine. It's that simple, to the point that Rich made. We are supply constrained. So we have got we need 11 billion doses of vaccine to get the world to 70% coverage across the different countries. More than 11 billion doses will be made this year. We've already used nearly 6 billion doses of those vaccines, but of those 6 billion doses, only 280 million of them have gone through COVAX, which is set up to make sure doses get to the people that really need them. So what do we need? Number one, we need the manufacturers to say, you know what? We are going to help the low-income countries and low-middle-income countries catch up. And then we need the political leaders of the countries that have got high coverage already, that have contracted a lot of doses, to say, okay, we will swap our place in the queue with COVAX to make sure manufacturers don't have an excuse not to get the doses in there. Sorry to play hardball here, but I have to speak for the hundreds of millions of people who aren't getting vaccinated. And then we need countries that say, well, actually, we're not in a position to swap doses. Great, donate them then. So there's lots of things that can be done. And every day, Mick, we're having companies explain they're getting better yields than they expected. They're able to make even more than they expected. Well, then why last week did COVAX, the mechanism the world is set up to serve the lowest income countries, to make sure we all get out of this thing together, why did they have to cut their forecast by 25% the day after IFPMA came out and said, we've got enough vaccine to vaccinate the world? So we have a major, like Rich said, distribution problem, right? And this is where the private sector, the people who are on this call, are so crucial. because governments listen to you, political leaders listen to you. And we cannot get, and Rich is the best person in the world to speak to this, the global interconnected economy moving again. We can't get our global supply chains moving again unless we can get vaccination to where it needs to go. The IMF came out and said, look, $4.5 trillion in foregone economic gains over the next 4 years if we can't vaccinate the most vulnerable everywhere in the world. And this is a solvable problem, Mick, between, if you look at what does it take to get the low, middle income countries from where they are today to 40% by the end of the year, we need 2.3 billion doses of vaccine. Now, that sounds like a lot, but if we do the math, the world is going to make 6.5 billion doses of vaccine between now and the end of this year, right? If we look at the burn rate in high income, upper middle income countries and India, it's less than 1 billion doses a month. So do the math. There's 2.5 billion doses of vaccine that are tied up in contracts that aren't going to use them, or they're going to take them and then donate them back to COVAX with incredible inefficiencies. Great, that's a good stopgap measure, but like you said, Mick, it doesn't solve the problem. So we have a completely solvable problem. We could end this pandemic within the next 12 months. You don't have to wait that long. We could finish it in the next 6 months, but it is going to require an unprecedented deep breath by the boards of the big companies, big breath by the political leaders to solve it. And then we're going to need the private sector, everyone on this call, Mick, to help developing countries turn on the machinery to solve the logistics, the communications, the other challenges to getting these doses in people's arms. But you know what? Let's deal with the constraints in the right order. The first constraint is supply. And as long as we're supply constrained, this is going to be, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we'll dump these vaccines in countries, at scale without having given them a chance to warm up like the rest of the world had.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bruce. And I know our team put out a response last week to the summit saying, it's great to have a target, great to finally have leaders rallying behind a roadmap. But actually, to your point, if we wanted to, we could probably address this by March next year or in the next 6 months. And I know even according to Affinity, across the G7 and the European Union, when you take into account even the need for booster shots, there's still 1.7 billion doses stockpiled that could be redistributed by the end of the year. So I agree with you. It's great, but we can and should be doing more. Moz, Bruce spoke about some of the challenges facing COVAX. He spoke about last week, and it does seem to be this, the numbers don't add up when you talk about how much is being produced, and yet you hear about COVAX, struggling to meet its goals, despite working very hard. Are you able to give us some insight into the challenges you've been facing, and where, in an ideal world, if you had, the pharmaceutical CEOs before you, the governments before you, what your ask would be of them to speed up the delivery? Because I know there's a lot of frustrations out there, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. And Bruce, Bruce made an extremely eloquent case for the different actors to play their role. I mean, we've already achieved, COVAX has achieved significant progress in line of where we started. And more than $10 billion have been raised. We've been able to kind of bear down on 4.5 billion of commitments. I think last week we hit 260 million doses that have been delivered to 141 countries. So this is not easy stuff, because this is probably the largest, most complicated rollout in history. And despite all the successes, as Bruce mentioned, only 1.8% of people in low-income countries have that. So we do need that commitment, that political commitment from the pharmaceutical industry to support us. We do need that political commitment from governments, and we have that, and we should certainly say, certainly appreciate that support. Can we do better? Absolutely. And should we do better? Absolutely. We must. How are we thinking about this in terms of, making sure we're at the right level in the queue? And I want to make sure that we touched upon those aspects, and I'm not going to go over those because I think Bruce, you really hit the nail on the head there. But for the private sector, the real call is simple. There are three ways that the private sector can support us. One, contribute. This is the compared to the global GDP fallout, any funding that's given is going to be a rounding error for bottom lines. It's an investment in your operations for those who are globally situated. It's investment in making sure you have robust supply chains and product coming in. To advocate for us. This is not this is in your interest. This is in your future customers' interest. This is in the global interest. So, be with us on that train and help us get to where we need to go. And three, share us with your expertise. I want to thank on behalf of GAVI and BCG has been a phenomenal partner to us in supporting us in thinking through what is very complex when you think about what we're trying to achieve here and others as well. We need support from partners to help us on supply chains, very quickly. We already have, the good news is we have infrastructure. Countries, our partner countries, have infrastructure in place. It's not equitable everywhere, but there are supply chains. It's about strengthening and supporting them. It's about making sure that our partners such as UPS, who've been helping us on delivery, really looking at that and strengthening that. Are there others out there who can come towards us and support that mechanism? Partners on communications, making sure that the misinformation and around vaccination, particularly around COVAX and COVID vaccines, is stemmed. How do we make sure that we actually build confidence in vaccination? I think that's an important part that, GAVI, WHO, others around the table have been really focusing on that. Bringing forward the expertise around data. This is a solvable problem, as Bruce, you said, and the data is going to help us get there. So how do we think about the ingenuity of organizations that are reliant on, countries to kind of supply the workforce, increasingly in some countries? How do we make sure that those systems are really focused on that area? And finally, there is an opportunity to strengthen the systems here that will help us not just for COVID and COVAX delivery, but for the future case of routine immunization, because as we've said, this will happen again in some measure. So we have an opportunity to invest in our systems, and now is the time to do so. It really is. This is the time to invest for now and in the future. So I know we're short of time, so I'll pause there.
Well, thanks, Moz. We outlined three important points about how the private sector can play a role. And Rich, I want to come back to you. In your view, over the last 18 months, what have you seen in terms of private sector contributions to date, and where do you think they can be stepping up and playing more of a role?
So first, I thought Moz just gave a great summary. So of his 4 points, I would really just mainly want to build on. I think what we've seen, well, first of all, the innovativeness in the private sector to respond to something we've never seen and come up with solutions that are as powerful as the solutions we've got. Again, I think it's easy to look back and miss just how fundamentally a different place we are 18 months into a pandemic of a virus we hadn't seen before than we might have been, and we shouldn't diminish that. And the ability to scale at a pace where, to say you've got 10 billion, 11 billion, I think Bruce said vaccines in the year, like who'd have thought, even a year ago at this time that we'd be there. So we should not minimize that. I do think, though, this is a cross-society issue. Public, private, social, of how do we tilt the balance to get a more equitable distribution of vaccine around the world? And I think looking back, we will say we were too slow to be able to tilt some of the global supply chains that way. To be honest, I'm not sure that all sits on the private sector, but I think we have to start by saying we got an issue and we've all got to work to solve it. I think right now, we're about to see a shift. We watched it in a place like the US, overnight, we went from supply constraint to demand constraint. You could see it happen over like 3 weeks between late April and early May. It doesn't take long. I am on the optimistic side, and I hope it'll prove true, that it's going to feel very soon like the issue is much less around supply constraints as we work through so many of the other countries that are now far along the vaccine curve to, I wouldn't say demand constraint, but around operational and demand constraint. Operationally, how do we get lots of vaccines to the parts of the world that need it most and into arms, not just into countries, but into arms. And I would just pick up on the third, I agree with his first 2 points, but Moz's third point about the capabilities that the private sector has to bear in logistics, in navigating these different kinds of challenges and understanding how to motivate consumer behavior. There's a lot of things that I think the private sector can lend a hand, and it should be actively looking not just to donate money, which it should, but to donate capability to help go on this next challenge when we have supply to get it there. And then the final point we didn't spend much time on, I know we're running out, the pandemic response system for the future. What are we going to do to learn from this? We will have other pandemics. Hopefully they'll be many, many years away, but I wouldn't bet on it. And so what are we going to do to build the infrastructure around pandemic response, whether it's PPE, viruses, so we're never vaccines, so that we're never put in this situation again. And there's a lot of work and learning to be done. And I think the private sector has a contribution to make to that, but certainly groups like COVAX and groups like ACT-A and the social sector that's been so instrumental here have to help with governments to figure out what's the model for the future.
Bruce, any last thoughts from you? I think that's a good way to end it. Lessons for the future in 30 seconds or less.
I think to come back, Mick, to what happens if we don't achieve equity, right? And Rich really laid it on there, what the private sector can do to help get the doses out, absolutely crucial. But folks, we all lose if we don't solve this problem, right? People die who shouldn't have to die. Healthcare workers get more exhausted. Societies get frayed. We get more civil unrest. Economies stagnate. But most importantly, the virus evolves. It's in all of our interest to do it. It's a completely solvable problem. There is no voice more important, no experience more important, no capacity is more important than what the private sector can bring to this. So huge thanks, Mick, to you for moderating us, to everybody for getting on. But the big thanks are going to come in 9 months when we vaccinated 70% of the world, and only because the private sector pulled out all the stops. We can't do it without you.
Well, thanks, Bruce, Rich, and Moz. Always lots to discuss. Appreciate all of your insights. Thank you to the Global Compact for hosting us. Thanks for this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, distinguished panelists, for a great conversation. Thank you to our Uniting Business Live audience for joining us from around the world for today's Private Sector Forum. Please do continue to follow and post about this event on your social media platforms using the hashtag Uniting Business.